Okay. This might be a long one because it's like 10 pages, but we're getting through it. So this is Eros. So Eros is basically just to, um, give you some foreshadowing here. Eros is essentially the false love. Um, he calls it love based on the principle of opposition. Um, so this is between the first function and the third function. Eros, as a model of interpersonal relationships in marriage, is much more common than others. And this is no coincidence, since the principle of Eros lies in the mutual attraction of opposites. Nature, having laid down physiological differences between the sexes, seemed to predetermine the tendency of humanity, together with physiology, to consider the dissimilarity of psychologies in marriage as natural and necessary. The essence of physiological differences between the sexes is privy to some knowledge, some deeper, some superficial, but practically to everyone, maybe available to everyone. What the psychological differences between people is based on is still not clear. Therefore, the concept of psychosophy, it is now possible to get a completely unambiguous answer to the ancient question. Psychologically, in their tasks and expression, the first and third functions are opposite. That is, a person feels the opposite of his mental attitudes when he finds himself face to face with a creature whose first function turns out to be the same as the person's third function. If we imagine that such a situation turns out to be mutual, then this is Eros. The essence of Eros is the antagonism of the cross from the third function to the first. The Eros nerve can be systematically depicted as follows. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. In psychosophy, in this book, each function has two axes. It's either strong or weak. Okay, that's one axis. That's one dichotomy, you could say. And the other dichotomy is if it's result or process oriented. Okay, effective or processional. Um, so that would mean that the first function, being strong and productive or results oriented, and the third function, being weak and process oriented, are opposites. And the same would be true of the second and the fourth. However, even in this book, it seems as though just as the first and second position have a similarity in their strength, um, and the third and fourth do as well in their weakness, and the first and fourth have a similarity in their result orientation, and the second and the third have a similarity in their process orientation. There seems to be a hidden dichotomy, which is essentially something like protective versus open. Okay, with the first and third having this kind of protective, somewhat vulnerable, maybe aggressive nature, and the second and the fourth having this more open, receptive, pliable nature. Okay, so later on, that was formalized as, and it goes by many names, and there's different understandings of what these dichotomies are, different labels for them. But I think so far the best one is the one in attitudinal psyche, which is a derivative of psychosophy, in which, okay, instead of strong and weak, it's self-positive versus self-negative. Um, you could say like self-affirming versus self-doubting, maybe another way to put it. Then there's results and process orientation, which is self-explicable. And then there's the others positive and others negative dichotomy, or you could say like others positive being receptive to the influence of the other, whether it's other people or generalized other like the world, the universe. Um, and it's either being like receptive or kind of protective and wary of the other. Okay. So I think if you attitudinal psyche goes way beyond anything I've seen so far in explicating the relationships in a very systematic way, far more than Afanasiev does. Um, And in that, you could see that, okay, well, the first and the third aren't really opposites anymore because they do share one of these dichotomies. They share a position in the aspect. They're both others negative. Um, but nonetheless, it does seem through like experience with like typing people and thinking about it that these two positions do conflict just as the second and fourth conflict. And so it seems that conflict or incompatibility is really based on results versus process. So in overall, the result oriented functions do not get along with the process oriented um, interrelation in terms of intertype relations. So, for example, someone with first physics is not going to they're going to have friction with a third physics type as well as a second physics type. But they will have complementariness with a fourth physics type. So basically, all the type relations, their basic nature of complementariness rests on the results and process orientation. So in that sense, like it's kind of a privileged dichotomy compared to the other two, although the other two are quite important, but just not in terms of they're not as important in terms of intertype relations, but they do influence intertype relations. They're not the thing that's causing the basic complementariness or friction. Okay. So I'm just saying all that just to add an additional perspective, the perspective that I currently have, and the way as I'm reading through this, my thinking is influenced by attitudinal psyche. So I would disagree with the idea that the first and third functions are opposite, although I would agree that they are not complementary. And that maybe the way he's describing Eros will fit them nonetheless. So apologies for that long ass explanation, but there you go. And then the other thing was right. So these diagrams, basically, I can't read Russian. There's some Russian labels at the top. Um, they might be saying something of interest, but essentially, you have two columns. On the left, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the right, you have going down in rows 1, 2, 3, 4. And basically, the point of it is that he's drawing arrows between these. So, for example, a first physics type might be on the left, and a third physics type might be on the right. So he draws an arrow from the 1F to the 3F. Okay. The point being is that those crosses, like those lines, represent specific relations, okay, between the functions. So the Eros relation is a line that goes from the first to the third. So first to the third, when the aspect is the same, okay, whether it's physics or emotion or whatever, that's how you draw the lines. Is you look at one type's aspects and you go, okay, you're going to draw the line from physics to physics, from emotion to emotion, or from logic to logic, from volition to volition, and that pattern of those lines is essentially what determines what type of relation it is. Okay, and you can look at the relation as a whole. Okay, which there would be 24 relations. All right, and then you can also look at the parts of the relations, and some parts are going to be carried over from a specific type of relation to another. Like there might be two relations in which, there's a cross or a line that goes from the second to fourth function, right? But all the relations are going to have their unique pattern, even if they're composed of similar lines. And maybe I'm not explaining this very well, but maybe this is a time where you should just look at the video if you're only listening to it. So anyway, in itself, the purely speculative idea that the difference in physiologies must necessarily be followed by psychological antagonism, of course, would not have made Eros the dominant concept of marriage, if in the very crosshairs of the third function on the first there had not been from the very beginning of an unconscious similar to an animal instinct, extremely effective mechanism of mutual attraction. Um, this mechanism is simple. When a person tormented by the scarcity and vulnerability of his third function suddenly discovers opposite him a creature whom nature has awarded with the same, but in the form of the first, i.e., in excess, not only does the thought of the situation correspond to the common everyday ideas about the prospects of such a marriage come to his mind, but first of all, the assumption that his opponent will cover his meagerness with his excess will cover his ulcer with his armor. Um, the course of reasoning in this situation, if we imagine it as if from the perspective of a woman, looks like this. He is so smart, sensitive, powerful, strong-willed, that it costs him nothing to share with me, stupid, cold, frail, weak-willed, although it would be part of the surplus given to him by nature, so that I, Cinderella, will be transformed into a harmonious, invulnerable, irresistible, and perfect princess. Okay, I'm not sure where he's getting that quote from, or just making it up. This is exactly what, by her own admission, Nina Berberova, who was rather dry in terms of the third emotion, thought when she saw a certain NVM. She wrote, "The meaning of our meeting and our rapprochement, the meaning of our common life, 10 years, all the happiness we experienced together, the meaning of this love for both of us is that he for me and I for him were the personification of everything that was for both. At this stage of life, the most important, most necessary and precious. What was necessary and precious for me then and maybe always was to become dry, businesslike, coldish, calm, independent and reasonable, warm, moist, shocked, dependent and crazy. In him for me and in me for him, everything that we had lacked before in other rapprochements came into focus." Okay. It's a little bit garbled and hard to read, honestly. But I hope you kind of get where he's going with that. To say that in the situation of contemplating with the sick eyes of the third function, the shining eyes of the first function, with health and strength, illusions multiply like bugs, means to say nothing. Illusions, as previously said, are the only starter of love experiences, so feelings began to boil, the heat of passion spread through my veins, my head began to spin, love came in its erotic expression. All right, I'm going to take a sip real quick. If in the course of our reasoning we remember that the first function is not only redundant, but is also a person's calling card, what he unconsciously first puts on the table when they meet, then it will become clear. Love is Eros, and since the heart is free and ripe for pairing, falls on a person suddenly and forcefully like an avalanche, who, without preliminary estimates and shooting. He does not have time to understand anything, hears only a deafening explosion, and sees in an instant flash of light the long-awaited, strangely recognizable appearance of his betrothed. It's him, or she. Sinks in the pit of an individual's stomach when, at the first meeting, his eyes come across a business card of exactly the first function that he needs. The heart immediately ignites, the eyes close, and the person flies headfirst into the pool. Yeah, so point being is like, you have an ulcer, you have this weakness, you see someone who has this thing that you kind of envy in excess, and you're like, oh, that's a person for me. They'll complete me, right? The picture of Eros would be distorted if we imagined it in the form of an endless arch of rainbow rings. It's a complex feeling that's best described as love-hate. Part of the reason for this is the initial duality of the third function. The contemplation of the first function in this case not only caresses the eye, but also irritates. The ability of the first function to step on the calluses of the third from the very beginning, and due to its thick skin, not even notice its clumsiness, also does not please the third. In a word, the ambiguous spirit of lust and hostility constantly hovers over Eros. As Catullus wrote, "And I hate her and love her. Why, you ask me? I don't know myself, but that's how I feel and languish." Everything would be fine in anticipation of future bliss, it would be possible to restrain irritation if all the troubles with Eros were not a waste of time and effort. The most tragic thing about Eros is that the hopes placed on the first function by the third function under the system of love are not destined to come true. The root of the problem is not that one is depleted while the other has an excess, but in the fundamental incompatibility of attitudes. The first is effective, the third is processional, and this circumstance dooms the bearers of both functions to eternal mutual deafness. So there he's making it clear that it's it's not actually the strength or weakness, right? It's not the weakness of the first, the excess, the strength of the. I'm sorry, it's not the weakness of the third, the strength of the first, but it's the fundamental incompatibility is the effective versus processional, or you could say results orientation versus process orientation. To make it clearer how and why this happens, I will give an example. Let's say a woman with third physics meets a man with first physics. Naturally, she is fascinated by the power of the function that is opened up to her, which she herself is wounded by and decides, this is it. Since her third function, which made a choice, is super processive, the calculation is simultaneously based on the fact that with this partner, she will begin a stormy joint process of creating everything related to the physical layer of life. If we translate the illustration into a culinary plane, then say a woman begins to dream about how they will cook some luxurious dish together. And what will be expensive in this action is not so much the dish itself. In other words, what will be valuable in this action is not so much the dish itself, but the process of preparing it together. At the same time, the woman, in her refined third function, will take upon herself the final stage of preparation and give the dish a unique, subtle aroma. Right. Okay. Uh, the reality turns out to be exactly the opposite of the dream. When lunchtime comes, it turns out that a partner, with his productive monologue first physics, has already prepared everything himself and eaten everything himself. The process of destroying castles in the air has begun. Of course, the woman cannot immediately come to terms with the specific psychology of the physics of her opponent and demands that from now on he take care not only of his stomach but also of hers. It is possible that a loving husband will treat a woman's request with understanding, but it does not follow from this that her dream will thereby come true. He will simply bring a bucket of some semolina porridge and place it in front of her with the words, "This is for you, honey, eat." Looking at this situation through the prism of psychosophy, one can understand both. The owner of the first physics, for whom the result is dear and the result is redundant, rather simplified in form, could not behave differently. But on the other hand, the confusion of the owner of the third physics is also understandable, who seemed to be receiving according to the function physics, for which she wanted to receive, but it is so wrong that what is happening is perceived as a blow and really is a blow in physics. Okay. Yeah, so basically what he's saying is that it's not that either of them did anything wrong. It's just that she perceives it as a blow because she wanted to enjoy the collaborative process of doing something in physics. And I think that example is like pretty good actually because, you know, as a 3F type, it's kind of like I can very much imagine myself getting in that situation with a 1F woman and having the same like disappointment because you kind of yeah, it's just like the dream of doing again something collaborative in with like food preparation, imagining like the fun of it, and yeah, even if it comes out shitty, like who cares? It would just be kind of like it would be a fun experiment, an enjoyable memory, but then to have someone who's just like completely independent, um, and doesn't really care, and they're just kind of like, why would you care? I mean, I made good food and it's here you could have some, I guess. um, that would be, and maybe that person in other ways is, this first physics type, this imaginary first physics type. Maybe they're, a breadwinner. Maybe they're, you know, they're collaborative in other ways, but because there's a mismatch in physics, that there's a mismatch because of that. It's like there's a missed opportunity for love to for like true love to happen, for something like real and fun to happen. So I think you get it. All right. So anyway, Um, However, it is impossible to reject a sincerely offered gift. The porridge has to be eaten, and while the woman is eating, there is still a glimmer of hope in her soul that what happened is just an incident, a small mistake due to mutual misunderstanding, which can be corrected in the future. However, this hope is not destined to come true. The different orientations of the functions make this incident chronic and insurmountable. Only the circumstance will become clear after several years. Of course, the culinary example does not look tragic, but if you imagine that the conflict mechanism is equally effective for the entire physical layer of life, economics, law, childbirth, sex, etc., then I think the tragic background of the contradictions between the third and first functions will appear quite clearly. At the same time, it would be wrong to think that the life of the third function under Eros consists only of blows. The first function not only hits, but also protects. I think that not a single person with third physics would refuse to have such a powerful and fearless spouse as Goethe's wife, who personally threw a crowd of Napoleonic soldiers out of the poet's house. The problem is not in the strikes and not in the defense. The greatest era, and of course it cuts off, but he's about to say the greatest evil of Eros is that blah 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 blah. So let me review this paragraph here. Right. So right. Okay. Basically, it's that the greatest evil is that people can be both, um, you know, they can both be objectively quite, good and doing good things. Like he gives the example of a first physics type, I think, who's Goethe's wife, who threw a crowd of Napoleonic soldiers out of the poet's house. Um, uh, do, but it won't be appreciated, and it won't feel, and that's the thing that matters. It's a feeling of incompatibility that um, one's vulnerable third position is not being like healed of its kind of grievance, its weakness. I really wish it didn't cut off there. It would have been nice to have that portion. But Eros becomes even more painful in the case when the crosshairs from the first to the third function is supplemented by the crosshair from the second to the fourth, as in the diagram. Here we are faced with a familiar picture of the dissimilarity between the principles of the processional second and the effective fourth. The main thing in it, the same impossibility of the process. Using the culinary example, we can say that the fourth physics does not share the sincere and tireless interest of the second physics in nutrition. At the table, she is an indifferent guest, without excitement, chewing everything that is served, not upset even when she is refused she is refused food from the table. This is a dependent who has completely entrusted his physics to his partner and considers such a gift sufficient for family life. Okay, so we could see why the fourth and the first would be complementary there. True, the antagonism between the second and the fourth does not look as dramatic as the antagonism between the first and the third. There are two reasons here. Firstly, both the second and fourth are not traumatized, so the conflict between them is mutually painless. So, the first and the third are protective, right? Secondly, the second function usually easily captures the fourth and, like a boat, forces a barge to move in its wake, which creates the illusion of complete agreement and unanimity of the spouses in all matters relating to this layer of life. The illusory nature of well-being in such a system of relations lies in the fact that the second, instead of the desired process of co-creation, receives submission, and this, you see, is not the same thing. And although being strong and flexible, the second does not suffer much from this circumstance, yet at the same time she experiences some unconscious itching, feeling, blah blah blah. Translation cuts off again. Brutal. Based on everything that has been said about Eros, one may get the opinion that the two crosses of processional functions into productive ones, or as it can be called, full Eros, is the most difficult version of marriage and long-term cohabitation. with such a combination is impossible. And this is partly true. As far as the severity of this option is concerned, this assumption is absolutely correct. There is nothing more severe than it. As for the impossibility of living together, such a conclusion would be premature. Let me give you an example of the story of a couple I know well. The psychotypes of this couple were combined, or rather not combined, as follows. So I don't know the Russian font, the Russian Cyrillic or whatever. So I have no idea what those types are. Um, but what matters is that they are conflictors. Okay. Um, they got married quite late when a significant part of their friends and acquaintances had already gotten married. Judging by a few casual phrases thrown out, they did not feel much enthusiasm for each other, but the time came. She was the smartest among the girls he knew. He was the most emotional among the boys she knew, and this crossover from the first to the third function decided the matter and linked their destinies. A child was born, who remained the only one which, with her third emotion and fourth physics, seemed to suit both. Life went on as usual, not too painful, but not too joyful either, although the contradictions of full Eros, of course, made themselves felt. Berthier, or Berthier, I don't know how to pronounce this name, or many of the names in this actually, so that's LFEB, was worried about the emotional isolation of the Ghazal on himself. Okay, so that's EVLF. Okay. Lack of sympathy, so to speak, interspersed with explosions of often dark-colored fourth physics experiences, painfully wounding her extremely restrained third emotion. But cheerful, so restrained but cheerful because it's LFEV is second physics. Ghazali was oppressed by the taciturnity of the Bertier, the refusal to indulge in what could look like empty chatter, and once the Bertier condescended to talk, she turned it into a monologue consisting of stone dogmas that were not subject to criticism. However, there was also a positive side to this situation. When Bertier's friends tried to put pressure on her emotionally and even accuse her of insensitivity, she called on her husband, and he, immune to this kind of pressure, shouted down any attempts to impose an extraneous emotional order on their home. Ghazali started a similar practice. When in arguments with friends he felt that he was drowning, he called his wife and she beat them down with her categorical judgments, just as she usually beat him up. In a word, the usual picture for the crosshairs of the first function was developing into the third function. Crosshairs of the first function was developing into the third picture. Not sure what that means. Usually, in this case, there was a crosshair from the second function to the fourth. It so happened, for example, that the Ghazali, with his second will, was forced to constantly decide the fate of the family alone and bear responsibility for everything alone, receiving instead of a full-fledged partnership, submission, albeit convenient, but leaving him alone in the face of the blows of fate, fourth volition. Goncharov described very precisely the specifics of the relationship between the second and fourth will in the novel Oblomov, recreating the relationship between Olga, second volition, and Oblomov, fourth volition. Goncharov wrote, she understood more clearly than he what was happening in him, and therefore the advantage was on her side. She openly looked into his soul, saw how the feeling was born at the bottom of his soul, how it played and came out. She saw what was wrong with him, with female cunning, coquetry, and she saw what was wrong with him. Female cunning, coquetry would have been superfluous because there was no fight ahead. Okay. She even saw that despite her youth, she had the first and main role in the sympathy that from him one could only expect a deep impression, passionately lazy submission, eternal harmony with every beat of her pulse, but no movement of will, no active thought. Returning from Oblomov to the relationship of the couple we are describing, I would like to note that, in turn, the second physicist, Berthier, was embarrassed by her husband's lack of genuine, inherent passion for sex and everyday life, Although sabotaging these, there was no need to catch his fourth physics questions. Yeah, pretty brutally kind of garbled there, but we get the idea. Full Eros rarely comes without betrayal. It was there in this case too. Ghazali changed. Berthier, having learned about the betrayal, and so according to the fourth will, was not distinguished by decisiveness during the crisis. She simply turned off her will and, falling into prostration, began to wait for the decision of her fate. Ghazali, according to his first emotion, was in euphoria. He was even going to get a divorce and get married again, i.e., transfer the responsibility of the second will from the wife to the homewrecker. However, it so happened that the only novel in his life ended in nothing. Um, do, do, do. So I don't know what novel is supposed to mean here. If novel actually means the adulterous partner, like the only what would you call it? There's a word for it, but basically the adulterous situation in his life ended in nothing. So I don't know. The Ghazal romance burst because the romances of married owners of the third logic usually burst, because both his marriage and his adultery were purely intellectual. Having married a woman with first logic for the sake of her analytical abilities, which, as it later turned out, did not allow him to open his mouth, the Ghazali, tired of communication, could not help but pay attention to the woman, most likely with fourth logic, who agreed to talk less and listen more. As for physical betrayal, the Ghazali, according to his fourth physics, was not inclined to it, but he did not see any obstacles to paying for the gratifying silence of his friend with physical intimacy. When the homewrecker demanded a divorce from him, the Ghazal ultimately rejected the idea of divorce. What made up the honey and the meaning of his novel was about the comfort of communication, not cohabitation. To destroy the current situation in order to satisfy the need for a grateful listener seemed to be an exorbitant price, and by and large, it was so. Um, I'm finding this very hard to follow, so I guess just bear with me. The novel Ghazali occurred during the most fateful period in a person's life, um, between the ages of 35 and 45. The danger of this period, and perhaps its blessing, lies in the fact that, feeling the hopeless unwellness of his life, a person realizes the period called by the Greeks acme, the period of completeness and flourishing of personality, is coming to an end. Therefore, the problem of unwellness of life, if it exists, it can no longer be postponed until later. Fate must be changed right now, otherwise there will be neither the spirit nor the strength to change it, and vegetating until death in the current situation is inevitable. It is during this period that strange madness occurs, sharp turns in the lives of overripe uncles and adults, suddenly infected with the ardor of youthful passion, trying to deceive fate and start all over again. Yeah, I mean, that is true. And it's, comes for all of us. I'm 32, so I'm kind of waiting for that to hit, but maybe trying to get a head start on it. The end of Acme also became a crisis for Ghazal, but the crisis in this case passed without changing anything. Many years passed, and he began to note that he was happy to return from work to the previously not very attractive house. Berthier is a very domestic creature by nature. She always saw the home as the center of her interest, the habit of living together, the division of spheres of influence, and that measure of mutual alienation that allowed them to live together without stepping on each other's calluses did their job. And there's no doubt that the rest of their days, Ghazal and Berthier will spend together, although the content of this together will differ sharply from the ideas that they had when they got married. And only an unconscious feeling that with another spouse, life could be lived fuller, more interesting, brighter. And it cuts off a little bit, but we get the idea. So basically, that was like pretty rough to read through. I feel like it could have been greatly reduced, but we get the idea. Two people, they were conflictors, and they had high hopes at the beginning, but then, their conflictive personality types kind of reared their heads. And I think one of them, the guy, had like he cheated on the wife, and I think he divorced her. I don't know. Maybe he divorced her, or just had a fling, and then that didn't work out. And then he came back to his wife, who was his conflictor, and then they actually kind of like spent their. They decided to like just live together, and they were just like, continuing their marriage or trying to make it work. Um, and they kind of learned like this uneasy cohabitation, but there's still an unconscious feeling nonetheless that they could have lived much fuller lives um, with different people. So kind of sad, but at least they made it work. Um, okay, a reasonable question. What then destroys families if even such a self-exploding model as full eros does not always lead to divorce? Well, the syntax of love does not undertake to govern essentially formal acts such as marriage and divorce. Its scope, determination, and forecast of measures of mutual attraction and alienation, measures of mutual interest, compatibility, no more. Okay. In addition, Eros usually falls on the spouses with the full weight of its inconsistencies only when they remain face to face for a long time, without intermediaries. More often than not, the situation occurs during vacations, and it is vacations that he remembers as the most critical periods of coexistence. In ordinary life, there are many factors that separate potential opponents into different corners of the ring. Work takes up the lion's share of time. In addition, a person is usually surrounded by enough people, household members, relatives, friends, colleagues, with whom one can vent the soul in the event that the soul is not vented, but rather is traumatized by direct contact with. Okay, so basically, you know, you can live with your conflictor or relations that are heavy in eros, um, fair enough, finally enough if you're not really interacting with them due to like work. You just come home, have brief interaction, and then off to your separate niches. The problem rears its head the most during prolonged vacations because then you have to spend time with the person, and then you realize that you hate each other. I think regardless of psychosophy, even if psychosophy is bullshit, that is certainly true. Finally, I will reveal the main reason why divorces do not occur even with full eros. The fact is that divorces as a legal act is associated with only two of the four functions, will and physics. Interesting. This legal act regulates mutual responsibility and liability to offspring, placing special emphasis on the physical side of life. Therefore, with Eros, only processional wills and physics show a real readiness to break. The same cannot be said about processional logics and emotion. Okay, well that's interesting. So, if anyone's listening to this who is familiar with attitudinal psyche, um, what that would mean, or what he's basically saying there, is that uh, he's basically saying that Dios, okay, so the second sexta, and that Dios are the ones who are most likely to divorce because Dios have process will and process physics. But Pentes, who are process logic and emotion, are not likely to divorce. So, don't know if that's true at all, but there you go. Let us remember why, without reaching the point of divorce, the romance of the famous Ghazal burst into flames. Obviously, because experiencing the greatest discomfort, according to the third logic, he could, without testing his family foundations, simply communicate on the side in parallel. Such intellectual polygamy is not subject to any trial. It's a different matter when the will and physics are exposed to trauma and family life. Here, there shouldn't be a parallel life that compensates for the structure of an official marriage, at least in the European view, and divorce becomes the only way out of the situation. Hmm. Okay. In this way, a certain law of divorce with full eros can be deduced. It may sound like this: full eros, the most difficult form of interpersonal relationships, is resolved by divorce with the processivity of physicists. Oh man, is resolved by divorce with the processivity of physics and will, and is in no way resolved with the procession of logic and emotions, although it is fraught with crises. Hmm. Okay, it's resolved by divorce. With them. Okay. Hmm. Still trying. So again, it's about Dio and Pente. He's making a distinction between Dios and Pentes here, but I'm not really. I don't know. I'm trying to make sense of it more. To make it clearer, I will give an example. Akhmatova sometimes spoke with poorly concealed contempt about women who are unable to leave their husbands when the last spark of love had burned out in her heart. However, here's the thing: Akhmatova's own life did not agree well with her theory. It was not she who usually left her husbands, but they who left her. There is no reason to suspect Akhmatova of hypocrisy. Therefore, it is better to look at the order of her functions to make sure that a more faithful wife than Akhmatova simply could not be found. Let me remind you that Akhmatova had first will, second emotion, third logic, and fourth physics. So she's a VELF. And from this order of functions, it is clear that Akhmatova has no contradiction between word and deed. As a person with the first will, she really was the mistress of her destiny, and if she decided to make any changes in her family life, she decided finally and irrevocably. Another thing is that Akhmatova had no need to change anything about her. Her first will was already absolutely independent, and the physical layer of her life under the fourth physics meant too little to seriously influence family choice. If something in the husband's behavior did not correspond to her ideas about what should be done in emotional logical terms, the translation cuts off yet again. Um, well, carrying on. Among other things, Akhmatova's example is remarkable in that it points to the existence of types who are, as it were, initially predisposed to stability in marriage, regardless of the situation. This circumstance could be extremely attractive for people who are eager to find at least something solid in the stormy sea of everyday life. If marriage in this case were not a purely formal act, consolidating something that in reality cannot exist, marriage, Akhmatova and the types close to her are too autonomous and too indifferent precisely in those points that constitute the essence of an informal marriage. They are too autonomous and too indifferent in matters of will and physics to strive for true pairing. So I'm really trying to make sense of this because I think he might be saying here that while the will and physics types split more, um, there's something that kind of there's like it's like two. I'm trying to make sense of this, so hold on. It's been a while since I read this last. Among other things, Akhmatova's example is remarkable in that it points to the existence of types who are, as it were, initially predisposed to stability in marriage, regardless of the situation. This circumstance could be extremely attractive for people who are eager to find at least something solid in the stormy sea of everyday life. If marriage in this case were not a purely formal act, consolidating something that in reality cannot exist, marriage, Akhmatova and the types close to her are too autonomous and too indifferent precisely in those points that constitute the essence of an informal marriage. They are too. Yeah, I'm not really understanding the point there. They are too autonomous and too indifferent in matters of will and physics to strive for true pairing. Okay. Not sure. Essentially, the wife never faces a dilemma. What is better, a stable marriage or an unstable one? She is interested in something else. Do people need each other or not? although the confusion between one and the other due to the myopia of humanity does occur. Another erotic model of interpersonal relationships. I'm debating whether to. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead right here, real quick. I might have to split these up because these are pretty brutal to read through. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna stop here and make a new video for this next part of this section.